Okay, welcome everybody to week 2 of the George Washington Leadership Lessons. I really appreciate everybody coming on the line and coming back. Last week we had some really good discussion points and just wanted to thank everybody for that. And as you've noticed based on last week, the idea behind this is really much more to have a conversation, share ideas, share some insights, anything that we've learned separately that really resonates with you when we go through these different topics. Please jump in and share. When you do share, I would appreciate it if you would just say your name. That way the rest of the audience gets to know a little bit better who the voices are connected to. And then also, if anybody wants to reach out and connect with anybody else that's on this webinar series, please just let me know and we'll see about setting up an introduction. Sometimes you hear a comment, you hear an insight from somebody that you want to explore a little bit more. And so meeting up and exchanging some emails or phone calls and just getting to know each other can be helpful in learning more about your leadership lessons, as well as also growing and expanding your businesses. One of the items that I talked about last week was the idea of just slowly moving forward and slowly building up your skill set. Wherever you might be on the spectrum, taking a step forward really helps with just keep moving forward, keep progressing, because if you're not moving forward in so many of these skills and so many of these areas, you're really slipping and falling behind and you're not maximizing your potential. I know there's a great book out there called The Compound Effect. And in The Compound Effect, the premise of the book is that by building and putting little steps and little processes in place, that over time you end up with a large effort, a large snowball in a sense. And a good example of this compound effect was actually my old university where I got my MBA, East Carolina University. And that university had gone through the whole process of being accredited for a master's program in business, had gone through attracting the right professors, setting up the right curriculum, doing all of those small steps that you need to do to build up a program. And just a year before they were to become the first university in North Carolina to offer a master's degree, Duke University came in, spent a bunch of money, hired a bunch of professors, and beat ECU by a year in establishing a master's program. So there's definitely the Big Bang method of growing and developing a business, as well as excuse me, if you've got a phone and you're driving, if you could mute your phone. And I'll see if I do that as well. Okay, perfect. So just as an example of a compound effect or a Big Bang, one is just slowly putting processes in place to where you reach a pinnacle level, and the other one is coming in and throwing a lot of effort, a lot of money right at it. But by taking one step at a time, we'll be moving forward and we'll be growing our leadership skills. This week, what we're going to be talking about is a leader being courageous, having self-discipline, taking responsibility, and being determined. Chapter 4, the leader is courageous. A leader fills a void even when there is risk. And I think this is one of the items that really sticks out as far as not being what you would consider normal behavior. Normal behavior for a lot of us is that we want to fit in, blend in, keep your head down, stay part of the pack. But leaders will oftentimes rise out and step forward even when there's risk involved in taking action or stepping forward and assuming a leadership mantle. And it's one of those things where it takes practice and it takes time, I think, to develop that courage, because we do want to blend in. We don't like the idea generally of being exposed, being the only one out in the field. We're very much more of a blend in, stay together, don't raise your hand. And the perfect way to look at this is when you start a new class in school, how many times is it going to be a week or 2 weeks before the students are comfortable raising their hands and answering questions? It takes a while to get comfortable and to go ahead and take that risk. And, another part of that is a leader really steps in when a lack of action would lead to a fatal error. That's the whole, I think emergency situation that comes in, is that the leader will step forward when they see that the organization is going to be threatened, when the outcome is going to jeopardize everybody's future. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a life or death situation. It could be something along the lines of a business, knowing that if you keep moving forward in a business setting the way you are, the business is going to run into the ground. It's not going to be able to survive. And so somebody's going to step up and make suggestions. Somebody's going to step in and lead that team. Somebody's going to move forward and prevent the group or the organization from making that fatal error. And then, the last point from this chapter was really the leader knows the power of victory for an organization. When an organization is struggling, when an organization or team is down, there's a very, sense of energy that you can feel when you have an organization that's winning, that's used to winning. And then you also have that same lack of energy from an organization that's not used to winning. When everybody walks around with their shoulders slumped forward, with their heads down. And leaders know that the power of victory can really change the mindset and the energy for that organization. And have any of you ever stepped in to prevent a fatal error for your team or organization? Or has anybody seen this happen? I've seen this a couple of times with my experience with the Boy Scouts and my experience also in volunteering with the Forsyth County Disaster Response Unit. And that has been when you know that the team is starting to take action, that in these two examples that come to my mind, where somebody could become injured, somebody could become, very bad. I'm trying not to overblow this, but, loss of property, somebody being threatened, and somebody from within the group really steps forward to prevent that team from falling apart or making a mistake. And what the outcome was with that was that we all then had a very clear sense of who the leader for that group was. When you throw a bunch of equals in, it becomes sometimes a little difficult to find out who that leader is very quickly, because of that idea of everybody hanging back, everybody deferring to each other, everybody not wanting to necessarily assume the mantle of leadership. But when a crisis arrives, it tends to be when the leaders really step forward, or when you see leaders really step backwards, meaning they don't act, they don't lead other people out of the danger. And has anybody had that experience of really having a losing streak at work or in an organization? You're losing proposal after proposal. You might be having budget cuts. You might be having a number of different situations that come along that just make it feel like you can't win, that the organization itself is being crippled. A lot of times you find this, or you see examples within a team setting or within a sports setting, where you look at franchises, you look at teams that just are not used to winning. And you know that no matter what happens. I'm sorry, somebody wanted to chime in? Okay, that the organization, the team wants to win, but they don't know how to win. And when they suddenly start to win, when they suddenly start to turn things around, maybe they've gone in baseball with so many games, you get a lot of losing streaks that might be 5 games, 10 games, 12 games. Sometimes it's even longer. Basketball is very similar because you have more games to play than you do in other sports. And sometimes when those losing streaks happen, it's like the whole organization, the whole team becomes bogged down in quicksand. And it's not uncommon for teams just to quit. And even in organizations or your business can just quit when there's no sense of winning. There's no sense of being able to be out in front, to be able to enjoy the rewards for all those efforts. And this evening when I was coming home, I was listening to a sports radio station, and they were actually talking about the Denver Nuggets, who is a professional basketball team. And they were coming out of a team huddle in the fourth quarter, and the team chant was 6 more weeks, meaning the team only had 6 more weeks to go until the end of the season and when they were done. They have been on a losing streak. They haven't been able to win a lot. But with 6 weeks left in the season, that team has already quit. And you know that based upon what that chant was. Leaders will do whatever they can to make sure that their teams have a sense of winning. And for leaders, what we have to do is make sure that individuals, even if we're in a losing situation, meaning our team or our organization may not have won some proposals lately, we may not be doing everything that we want to do and execute as well as we want. It's important that the people around you get very personal feedback so that at least on the personal level, they understand and they have a feeling of winning. The team might not be winning, but at least if everybody on that team can feel like they're winning, you're going to keep that team cohesion. You're going to keep people caring about showing up to work and putting in effort. And it's going to be huge when you see people that want to stay and work longer, who want to put in that effort. And the only way that they do that is by a leader being courageous and showing and giving that organization a sense of victory. Now, how did Washington demonstrate courage? The first example that we had in this chapter was, and we talked about this last week, was that Washington volunteered at a young age to go deliver that message to the French. It was, and that message was essentially, you need to get out of the Ohio, you need to get out of the Cumberland, and that is England's territory. And as we talked about before, Washington was very young. Fairfax was the governor of Virginia, and Washington knew that by stepping up and stepping forward and taking that message to the French, he would be doing something that was very difficult and that not a lot of people wanted to be involved in because you didn't know how the French were going to react. It was also getting late in the year. There were some personal endangerments to be traveling over the mountains and going over into Western Maryland and into the Ohio, as the seasons are changing. And the second one is interesting, is that he took command from General Lee at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey and essentially turned a sure defeat over into a draw. And that may not seem like much, but, at that time, Washington's army was essentially outnumbered about 2-1 from the English. General Lee had orders to engage the English and to test his troops. They were coming out of Valley Forge at this time. The army had been trained by von Steuben, who had come over from Europe and was a Prussian and was training the colonial army to be almost a European-styled army. European-style discipline, reporting structures, all these different things. They'd spent all that time, money, and resources to train up the forces that Lee had, and Lee as soon as the first shots were fired by the British, turned his army around and was leaving the field, his troops ran right into Washington and Washington's troops. Washington is one of the few times where people really documented that Washington publicly dressed down an official, lost his temper, cursed, relieved General Lee of his command, took control of the forces, and at least fought the British to a standstill or to a draw. And so, it does take courage to publicly remove a leader. And sometimes you're forced to do that as a business owner, as a team lead, where you don't necessarily want to do, something that dramatic, because you are affecting somebody's career, you are affecting their lives. But by taking command and relieving somebody who's not proving to be very competent, you're saving your forces, you're saving the team, you're saving your business in many cases. And the last one lesson here was an example was that Washington created a plan to cross the Delaware River and attack the British and the Hessians in Trenton and Princeton. And if you read the book, Washington had talked about how to do this, how to achieve this, the strategic idea of pushing in the British out by winning a battle with the British and Hessians, not letting them set up a base that they could attack in the spring. He listened to counsel, and then at the end of it, he made his decision on what he wanted to do and really cut off all discussion. It wasn't up for a vote. It wasn't up for further discussion. He listened to his experts. He listened to his team. He drew up a plan of attack. He carried it out. And because of that action and because of that win, the colonials, who many of them, their enlistments were up, a lot at the time, a lot of people only signed on for 6 months or 8 months at a time. Enlistments were up. Washington had been pushed around New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York area, had had a number of losses, but because he knew the power of victory for his team, and he gave that to them, a number of those individuals re-signed with the forces and carried on with the struggle of the Revolution. Now, have you ever been able to witness where a leader really did step into that leadership void? And then, how does the organization, have you guys ever been involved in a situation where you needed to have that victory, personally or professionally? I know sometimes especially as small business people, we can sometimes be banging our heads, not seeing anything happening. But then you have to take a look back and you find out that you really were starting to set up a series of wins. You really were starting to build up that snowball effect or that compound effect. And you see that by knowing that you had to sacrifice some things, you had to create a bold plan for yourself or your team and really push forward and really come to the point where you can, get a sense of winning, get a sense of traction. And that's courage. The easiest thing for us to do as leaders when things get tough is just drop back and shrug our shoulders, say it's too hard, and move on. But leadership is being courageous, and it is moving forward in the face of adversity. And so it's just something to remember that as the going gets tough, the tough get going, and so do leaders. So the next chapter, chapter 5, the leader has self-control. And there was a great quote at the beginning of this chapter, and it was, remember not only to say the right thing in the right place, but far more difficult still is to leave unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moment. And I know for myself and others, if you have a quick wit, if you have a quick mind, sometimes your impulse immediately goes to saying the wrong thing, to offering, not just a retaliatory refutal of a statement that's incorrect, but also taking it and moving into an attack mode, letting your emotions get the best of you, and saying some things that you really, on reflection, don't want to have said, but they jump out of your mouth, they jump out of your mind so fast that you don't have time to pull it back. And, enemies will provoke us and look for that heated word. They will look for something, a soundbite to use back against you in the heat of a moment. And we see this, I think, a lot in our 30-second soundbite world, our quick hit, our Twitter feeds, a lot of different things that fly at us that provoke, and sometimes it's not even thought about, and then other times it is a deliberate strategy for people that are against us, for whatever reasons or in whatever context, to try to get you to say something that could be used against you at a later time. And the last thing out of this chapter or example here was being able to maintain control and moderation. And it allows for that thoughtful and measured response. It's Tony Dungy, and Tony Dungy, if you don't know, was a football player, head coach at Tampa Bay, head coach at Indianapolis. He's now a commentator for ESPN. But he does a lot of mentoring through his ministry efforts, and he also works a lot with new NFL players. And you might hear his name come up with troubled NFL players, somebody that might have been arrested for a fight in a parking lot or something else. Tony Dungy will sometimes step in and personally mentor that individual. But one of the lessons that he talks about when he addresses the rookies each year is this whole thing about don't press send on a tweet. Somebody calls you out for bad play, somebody calls you names from another team, a fan says something, whatever that you see on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. Athletes will tend to want to jump back in, and it's not just athletes, it's everybody. But Tony Dungy really stresses, do not hit send on that reply. Wait 24 hours, give it time, remove that emotion out of the response. And I think sometimes we see this too, especially, and it may be frustrating in the political arena, where you really want somebody who's leading your values, who political affiliation, what have you, where, your cause, your people are being attacked and you want somebody to come back out swinging, but it's a day or two later that they make a very measured or vanilla response, and sometimes we get frustrated with that. But they're doing that so that they don't give people an opportunity to come back and attack them. Because when you're in business, when you're working with ideas, when somebody can quickly come in and take something that you say out of control and take that passion that you have in your heat of the moment response, turn it around, use it out of context, it can completely destroy your credibility very, very quickly. So one of the things that I think leaders have to do is really be able to work to put the brakes on, especially when, again, somebody offends you, somebody attacks your position, somebody does something against you in a business setting. Not being in the heat of the moment and attacking and coming back at that person, but being very measured and being very deliberate in your response. Has anybody seen an example of someone or an organization being compromised by emotional responses? I think like I said, several times through history and through politics, there's been a number of people, very good, capable leaders, but they've responded to situations with such passion, such intensity of the moment that they ended up being taken down and having their credibility, having their leadership being completely wiped out and because of what their emotional response was. And, you know, have you ever seen somebody taking that action when they weren't centered? Does anybody have an example that they'd like to share?
Greg, this is Jeannie. I'll share something.
Hi, Jeannie.
Hi. Yeah, I think, I was in a human resources role for a long time and working with the C-suite. And, there were certainly situations that people, where people came under fire. During my tenure was the first time in nearly 50 years that the organization had to do a layoff. And, there were some difficult things for the company to survive. And the leaders were also under stress. And as a result of that, they were emotional much more frequently than they had been before. And, there were some outbursts that employees witnessed. There were more closed doors. There was just a heightened level of emotion, and it definitely affected credibility, the confidence of the staff in leadership, and in the stability of the organization. So, how leaders conduct themselves and being able to take a deep breath and to step back when necessary so that when they're presenting themselves, that they're composed and have a plan that they can share and can respond appropriately. It's just critical.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, and it's interesting too, because how you react as a leader sets that tone for that whole building or for that whole team. And, it can really put everybody else on edge. It can really take, somewhat of a harmonious situation and just make everybody feel threatened. And, not necessarily threatened that you're going to be fired or what have you, but it could be threatened in you're now afraid to take risks. You're now afraid to bring forward bad news. When you see the emperor has a violent outburst, you don't want to tell the emperor that he doesn't have any clothes on. And so as leaders, I think it's one of those things where, and I certainly have to work on this from time to time, is remove yourself from the situation, be very thoughtful with the words you take, especially as leaders. The higher up you go in the leadership chain in an organization or in a team, the more power I think your words have. And, even a measured response with the wrong language can send meanings that you don't need and that you don't necessarily want to be carried out. Now let's quickly take a look at how Washington, some of the examples that Washington had. There's really no documented evidence that he ever drank or ate to excess. And this is somebody that had many dinner parties, had many people coming over, lots of guests, especially once he was in the presidency, as well as at Mount Vernon. But there's not any recorded evidence that people have been able to come across revealing that Washington had too much to drink or was a glutton with his diet. And Washington did have a fiery temper, well documented in his youth, that he would strike out, that he would respond, and that, the example that I gave before when he relieved General Lee of his command is one of the few examples during the Revolution that people had where he really used swearing, where he dressed somebody down in public. And, it turned out that action proved to be right. Lee was later court-martialed, removed from the Army, and essentially died in somewhat disgrace. And he kept the responses to any personal attacks. He kept those in private. He kept those entrusted letters to individuals within his inner circle, which was not very wide. And he didn't enter into the fray. And the example I put on here is the Hamilton and Burr. And for those of you that don't know, Hamilton and Burr, both from New York, both political rivals. Hamilton thought Burr and his political organization were going to back him in the run against Jefferson for the presidency. Burr ends up as vice president. They use friends of theirs in the newspaper to write disparaging remarks and stories and accusations against each other. It boils up to the point where these two political rivals meet for a duel in New Jersey. Burr, the vice president, shoots Hamilton, kills Hamilton, and then becomes a fugitive from justice. So you have a vice president of the United States who kills somebody, is on the run, and that's just an extreme example of entering into a fray, a very public fray, and not handling things quietly and not just letting comments go. And the last one here is, as far as we know, he publicly maintained a faithful relationship with Martha. I'm by no means an expert on Washington, but from documentation and books and things that I've read, he danced with everybody. He smiled at everybody. He might have flirted with a number of people. But once he was married with Martha, as far as anybody can tell, he maintained that faithful relationship and had self-control. And one of the things that we see is so many times political figures, going off and having different relationships, outside of the bonds of marriage, cheating, whatever you want to call it, having a mistress, different things. But he was faithful in that relationship and exercised self-control in those regards. Chapter 6, the leader takes responsibility. And boy, this is a tough one, especially if you have an organization that really does not allow for what I would call non-fatal errors. If you missort something, if you make some very human mistakes and the consequences are very high, either privately or publicly, people are going to shrink from taking any kind of responsibility. But, a leader has to step up and really take and own that criticism when it's just. When you make a mistake, the best thing to do is to step up, take responsibility for it, work out a strategy to make up for that mistake, and then move on. I think one of the things that really, set good leaders from great leaders is that great leaders will say, yes, I made a mistake. I misread the situation. Bad call. I own it. I'm responsible for it. Now we move on. And then that really takes the power away from any kind of enemies, any kind of anxiety about what's going to happen to an individual. When you just own it, there's nothing people can say about it. You're not trying to hide it. It's not something that somebody can use against you because it's very public. You're very accepting of that. And when given a difficult task, great leaders don't shrink from them. They don't try to find a way out. And I read more about this relationship and this conflict between Washington and General Lee. And one of the things that was interesting with that was initially Lee was given responsibility for the Army. He did not want to attack and engage the British and asked to be relieved. He was relieved. Washington turned around and was giving that section of men to Lafayette, Lafayette was going to go ahead and lead the troops and engage the British. And then Lee spoke up again and decided to take responsibility for the army. And Washington let him do that, but it was the fact that a very young man, Lafayette was in his early 20s, did not have the experience that Lee had. But it took Washington giving that task to Lafayette before Lee stepped back up and said, no, I want that. And so Lafayette stepped down and Lee stepped in. And we know the story from that point. But leaders take on those difficult tasks. They don't try to find somebody else to do it for them. They don't, even if they know it's going to be difficult, even if they know that they may not succeed, they're going to step forward and they're going to do that. In integrity and not perfection. I think that's one of the biggest things. And this statement and this phrase here could be applied for just about any chapter in this book and any leadership lesson that you have, is doing the best you can with honesty and with integrity. And if you don't make a perfect decision, if you don't have a perfect outcome, at least you've done everything you can to make sure that you were in the right and that you were doing the best that you could. And nobody can attack you for a lack of integrity if that's the basis for your decision making, if that's the basis for your actions. And caring for those under your leadership and protection as if they were your own. You own that relationship. The people that you're leading, even if by age-wise or what have you, or peers, you protect them and you shelter them, you give them the tools that they need to succeed, and then they're going to step up and they're going to meet the tasks that you lay out for them. And then this last point's probably a little bit more personal, but it's really taking personal responsibility for the management of your wealth and resources. A good leader is going to be able to sit down and do the best they can to manage their wealth and manage the resources. And that's going to be doing budgets. It's going to be doing some of those hard things in your personal life so that your external or your business life, or however you want to phrase that, is going to really be able to shine and come from a base of power and a base of success. Now, why do you think that people resist taking personal responsibility, whether it's for a team or even just for their own well-being? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I do, Greg. I think sometimes this is a reflection of society in general. We see our political leaders and our celebrities. No one is taking responsibility for their actions. They're blaming it on everyone else but themselves, whether it be the way they were brought up or alcohol or whatever. And I think that is something that needs to be developed as taking personal responsibility. It may be an old-fashioned attribute, but it definitely is something that a leader should develop.
Sure. Thank you. Do you think, and I'm just going to ask you a follow-on question here, Lori, do you think some of that is partly due with our culture and society, in that it's almost like it's an all or nothing? So if you fall short, you're completely, disgraced, shunned. You get this failure tag associated with you versus a tag of, okay, well, that didn't work, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad person. So-and-so's not a bad person. So-and-so's learning from that. So-and-so's going to, move forward and keep progressing. Do you think it's, maybe some of that all or nothing ideas that we have?
That's an interesting question, because we do see within the media, we'll have a political leader who has fallen from grace, if you will, and then in a few short months is just back on top. I mean, even take our professional athletes. Tiger Woods is one of the most disgusting people, I think, but he's back out there, still taking endorsements, still swinging the club. And so, you know, people can be forgiven. I'm a definite believer in forgiveness. And apparently society is as well, especially when it comes to their political leaders and their celebrities.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, and this isn't directed back to you, Lori, but for everybody, does your team or your organization allow people to take responsibility and move on from non-fatal errors?
I think every healthy organization should be able to do that because nobody's perfect.
Right, right. Well, you know, and I think a lot of times too is that if you have this idea and you have an organization that supports that mindset, that you're going to see, I think, honesty increase. I think you're going to see integrity all around increase in the employees because they know that they can come in, take ownership, and that's a hard thing to do, to walk in or send an email saying, hey, I completely messed this up. It's my fault. I'm sorry this project's delayed, you know, or this activity happened or that activity happened. It's my responsibility. And then, you know, putting forth a roadmap of this is how it's not going to happen again, and this is how I learned from it, or this is how we're going to move around this, you know, this obstacle. When people have that feeling of being able to be safe, I think the idea of taking personal responsibility just goes up. And, you know, I'm hoping that that's one of the attributes that we want our teams to have, is encouraging the individual members to take personal responsibility. Now, let's take a quick look on how Washington demonstrated taking personal responsibility. Washington quickly, in the French and Indian War, took responsibility for the loss of Fort Necessity. Washington was put in charge of this fort. Essentially, he allowed the French to come in, surround him, and he ended up having to surrender the fort. And when he walked back and went back to you know, the commanders and back to the governor of Virginia, he quickly took responsibility and even cited his own deficiency of character for allowing the fort to be taken. And Washington didn't shrink from taking command of the Continental Army, even when with all the known issues for taking that command. You know, you have to think back at that point. Washington's taking command of forces that are loyal to individual colonies. Those forces that he had that were from Vermont, from Massachusetts, from Virginia, from South Carolina, wherever they came from, those forces were responsible and reported into the political leadership of those colonies. The fact that Washington was able to put them together and have them work as well as they did is a real testament to his leadership. But they were poorly equipped. You know, they're making up currency as they go. A lot of these men are farmers. They're signing short-term enlistment papers. You know, there's all these different things that are involved in building this Continental Army, where a lot of people would see that as insurmountable, or why take that risk to your reputation? And remember, at this time, your reputation is everything. So if you take control of the Army and you take that leadership mantle and it doesn't work out, that reflects on you for the rest of your life. You know, that reputation just sticks with you. So there's a lot of risk in taking that command. You know, he raised and interacted with Martha's children like they were their own, as his own. Martha had her children before she met Washington, and they never had children together. So these weren't his. There's a certain level of interaction that you have that would be considered friendly, but he wasn't under any kind of obligation to do much more than just support them financially. So whatever kind of emotional support, whatever kind of love, whatever kind of any of these things that he gave to those children were above and beyond, so to speak, what he was obligated to do. And, one of the things that's interesting is that he built and managed his estate and his holdings so that he could endow university and colleges. And at the end of his life, the question of slavery had come up with him personally during the Revolution. And it was a lot of these French leaders like Lafayette that came in, developed personal relationships with Washington that really convinced him of the need and how inappropriate the institution of slavery was. And even though Jefferson and a number of these other founding fathers talked about freeing the slaves, he was the only one to actually do it of the early founders, of the early presidents. And he was able to do that because he managed his personal estate and his personal holdings and was able to free them. Compared to Jefferson, and I'm not meaning to bash Jefferson, but Jefferson essentially died penniless and in debt and quickly had most of his holdings and possessions taken to pay off the debts as soon as he died, including the slaves. In Chapter 7, the leaders determined. And, I think throughout these chapters that we've already studied, we've really picked up on how determined somebody has to be to start out. We talked about the ambitions back last week, wanting to set out and wanting to expand the U.S. the way that Jefferson did with the Louisiana Purchase, the way that Kennedy set that goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. And so many of the other tycoons that started out oil and rail and all these different industries that really built America in the late 19th and early 20th century. That determination is just an undercurrent, I think, of what great leadership is all about. But being determined means that you're clear and focused on a direction, that you're not allowing distractions to come in, that you're not chasing every shiny object, and that you understand that losses and setbacks are part of the process. Washington lost an awful lot of the battles that he was involved in during his time as commander-in-chief of the rebellion, but he never lost perspective that at the end of the day, the purpose of the army and his purpose was to win the freedom of the colonies from England. And the leader finishes the task. You hear people talk about a really good measure of a team or an individual when it comes to sports or even business is you remember how that person finished. And sometimes we remember in sports a person finishing when they were really kind of a shell of themselves physically, but they still had that desire and they still had that fight to be out on the court, to be on the playing field, to play hard all the way through to the whistle, so to speak. And leaders are like that in business and in life, and great leaders especially, is they finish the task. They don't get to the point where the action's finished and they just walk away, leaving cleanup or leaving the last little bit of details to somebody else. The leaders are there up until the very end. And leaders uphold the values that you're willing to fight for. I think this is one of the things that becomes interesting, is that if you have a certain set of values, if you have a certain set of principles, leaders stick with that and they continue to fight even as they may be turning into a losing cause or a struggle. And they don't give up, because in those darkest times, that's when sometimes victory is handed to somebody. When they keep going, they keep going, and they keep going, and things look like they're the darkest, and you win because you're still willing to show up and fight the next day. And this is just kind of a rhetorical question, but how focused are you really in your business or your personal life? For those of you that get my newsletter, you may have read it today. I discussed about not being focused on activities at hand over this last weekend. That I had a lot of other things on my mind, had a lot of other ideas, had a lot of things that were bustling through, and I wasn't determined, and I wasn't deliberate, and I wasn't focused. And I think that robbed me of some personal enjoyment. But that can happen to us in our business and our personal life when we're not determined to see a course of action through, when we hit a rough patch and we need to keep, it becomes easy to give up and move off of that. So ask yourself, as we get ready to wrap up here, what's most important this week or this month or this year to you? And how do you react to your losses or your setbacks? When have you seen people that just abandon their strategy because of setbacks, try to move into a different direction, and then fail altogether? Where if they had stuck with one course of action, they might have had success. I want to move on to, how George Washington determined or demonstrated determination. And he, as I said before, he listened to the advice prior to crossing the Delaware, but then didn't put his decision up for a vote. He made the decision. He was determined to meet the Hessians and meet the British at an opportune time. It was right after Christmas. It was the Christmas Eve day, or day after, the evening of Christmas when they crossed over. The Hessians were pretty much drunk. Washington essentially lost 2 individuals in combat because he snuck up and surprised the German mercenaries. And had that win, that enabled and inspired people to sign up and stay with him, and it kept the army intact for the next set of campaigns. He was also determined to have a peaceable transfer of power and retired from politics after leaving office. It was still really up in the air if he was going to, go along with the election of a new president, if he was really going to not run again for a 3rd term, and was he at any point from the newly elected president going to turn around and not give up power? But I think one of the underlying principles that Washington had for the young democracy is that whoever was in that power position had to be willing to give it up. You're the most powerful person in the North American continent. You have an army that will fight for you. You have all this admiration and respect from everybody. All you have to do is say, I'm going to lead us for the next foreseeable future. And, from a military standpoint, nobody's going to, stand in your way. But he was determined to give up power. And that's something that's really, really unusual for anybody that's come to that level of authority. All you have to do is look even at Vladimir Putin. And I'm not comparing Washington to Putin, with the only caveat being, he came to power. Putin came to power. He stepped back. He came to power again. He's never really given up power. He's never allowed the peaceable transfer of power within Russia. And then finally, this last piece with Washington is that he maintained one course of strategy until its completion. He understood that the purpose of the army, the purpose of the revolution, was to win the freedom. And you're not going to do that by getting panic after a loss, after a series of losses. You're going to do what it takes to keep your army intact, to keep wearing down the opposition until they give you the victory that you're after. And so with those lessons, that's really one of the biggest takeaways that I've had, this last week, is being focused and determined. And I'll let anybody share this if you want to, but what lessons have you learned over the last couple of weeks that you might want to share, or what lesson has struck a chord with you? Does anybody want to share?
I do, Greg.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I think something that this brings to mind is especially that quote from Benjamin Franklin, you know, when we want to say that quippy, witty thing, even if we really don't feel like we are in a leadership role, maybe we're just a part of the team. But if we say those quippy, hurtful things, or just something that we think is very witty, there may be others around us who consider us a leader or an example or a mentor. And even if we aren't officially in a leadership role, we still need to be mindful of those hurtful, quippy little remarks.
Right. And there's all sorts of different leaders. You know, there's the informal, like, you know, you're bringing up the formal leadership, and you may not have that mantle, but, you know, the fact that everybody's here and the fact that we're all looking to expand our leadership potential means that in at least one or more cases throughout our personal or professional lives, we are leaders. You know, informal or formal doesn't really matter. You are a leader, and some of the things that you say, some of the actions you take, that reflects on you, and it impacts your team. Even if you're not, you know, the general in charge of thousands and thousands of troops, but you're an individual with 3 or 4 people, you are a leader, and people are going off of your cues and taking that lead. So, you know, thank you, Lori, for that. And then just one last question before we call it a night. And, you know, you don't have to answer this out loud, but think about it. What are some of the areas, or what's one of the, or 2 of the things that you can work on over the next week or 2 that you can do to strengthen your own leadership with individuals? For next week, we're covering the next 4 chapters, and that's the leader has a strong work ethic, leader uses good judgment, and a leader learns from mistakes. And as we talked a little bit about this evening, a leader is humble. I want to thank you all very much for coming by and attending, for calling in. And I definitely want to remind everybody we'll be doing this again next week at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And I look forward to everybody's input. This has been a recorded meeting, and I will be posting this up on my webpage, and I'll send out an announcement with a link to where you can find this recording. So thank you very much for joining, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.